So the first part of the 2 out of 3 rule involves the lumbar spine, and the lumbar spine is this part of the curve here, and typically from T12 down to about L5. And we want to be able to look at whether that curve appears to be too curved or about right, or whether it looks quite flat. So again, looking at the skeletal system, you can see how nice and easy it is to check here, but we do need to have a look at a real person to see how that actually changes. So if you move across here to my model, my male model here, you'll notice that all of this muscular development in a normal person's back makes it very difficult for you to actually assess the lumbar curve. So what we need to do is you need to find and put your fingers on and find each of the spinous processes. If we move back here for a moment, you'll see what we're trying to do is find the spinous process of the lumbar vertebrae. So we're trying to track those because they're easier to track, and because when we go back to our model, you'll actually be able to feel them with your fingers. So this is the lumbar curve between here. What we need to do is look at that lumbar curve, ignoring this muscle and the shape of the glutes, and just see if that lumbar curve is normal. So if we turn right side on, what you're going to do now is stand sideways, have a look at the person and make a judgment whether you think that curve is about 20 degrees or whether it's really flat or whether it's too curved. So if it's nice and evenly curved all the way through, we call that normal. If it's more curved, and I'll just get the person to exaggerate, you can see now that's an excessive curve, and we would call that part 1 towards an anterior tilt. If they're posteriorly tilted, you can see how that's really flat, and that would be 1 part towards the posterior tilt. So back to normal, you can see that's a nice normal curve. So when you do the lumbar curve in the 2 out of 3, for this subject, we would say that would be neutral. The second part of the 2 out of 3 rule involves looking at the angle of flexion at the hip joint. Now again, when you look at a person, sometimes it's very hard to make a decision of what that looks like. So typically we're going to use a goniometer here. I'll show you how to use a goniometer, and then I'll do it without a goniometer so you can have a guess both ways. So the first thing we need to do is come down the outside of the person's thigh until we find that large bony projection, which is the greater trochanter, and that's right there. That becomes the point of origin for our centre of our goniometer. So the first thing I do is get the centre of that goniometer, which is the central pivot, and place it directly over the greater trochanter there. Second thing I do is I use this black line and I point it up to the middle of the rib cage. So you can see I'm looking at the middle of the rib cage from side on, and I'm pointing it up so that it's aligned that way. Then holding that top arm so that this bottom arm still pivots, what I'm looking for now is looking at the knee joint, and I want to find the middle of the knee joint, which is here. From that point then, I'm going to line up and point that bottom arm directly down at the middle of the knee joint where my finger is. When I think they're both aligned correctly, I take it away and I now have a look at the reading. If you have a look at the reading here on the camera, you'll see it's about 4 degrees off the 0. Now what we look for with hip flexion is about 5 degrees either side of being completely straight. We consider that to be neutral. So this is 4 degrees forward, which means his hips are a little bit pushed forward, but not enough for us to take away from what we call a neutral tilt. So what we're looking at, if we go back to the hip joint, if Keegan can now do an anterior tilt, and if we do a quick check again, you can see now we're getting an alignment roughly like this, and you can see that's now 10 degrees forward, and that's what an anterior tilt looks like. Hips are tilted forward, flexion angle here is now more than 180 degrees, and that's what an anterior tilt will look like. Now if we do that in reverse and we go backwards, you'll see we now get a similar look here, but instead of being more than 180 degrees here, it's less, and that's what a posterior tilt looks like. So anywhere between 5 backwards and 5 forwards we take as neutral, but if it's more than 5 either way, we mark it down as being too far or too far backwards. The third part of the 2 out of 3 rule, we'll go back to the skeleton again to give you an idea of what we're looking at. We need to be able to palpate the ASIS, anterior superior iliac spine, and the PSIS, which is the posterior superior iliac spine. So note that there is an inferior anterior iliac spine and also an inferior. So we've got superior, inferior, superior, inferior. So we're looking at the 2 anterior spines, front and back. First thing we need to do is find those, and I'll use the skeleton to show you first of all. Second thing is, try and get a line that's roughly horizontal, and then put that line up with the top spine between the ASIS here and the top of the spine. Now that'll give you a rough idea. What we're looking for is for a neutral spine, the posterior spine must be between 0 and 20 degrees above horizontal. And you can see this one is about 18, so that would be a neutral spine. If the spine was tilted more and the posterior spine was higher than 20 degrees, that would indicate an anterior tilt. If the spine is below horizontal, so that it looks like this, that's a posterior tilted spine. So between 0 and 20 is neutral, above 20 degrees is anterior, and below horizontal is posterior. So if we take that across to our model again, and we're looking at sideways, so the first thing we need to do is be able to palpate anterior superior spine, which is here, and the posterior spine. Now this may be a little bit tricky, so if we turn around again, and if you have a look, typically what you'll look for, and I don't know whether you can see them clearly, are these 2 little indentations just here. Now if you put your finger in the middle of those and move your finger around, you'll actually feel the bony protrusion of the posterior spine. That's what we're looking for. So the other way to do it is find the outside of the hip bone, which is this point here, and we're going to track it back until we find it. That's another way of doing it. So you can find it and you can move all the way along until you get down to where that posterior spine is. So once you've found that, we go back to the sideways position, put one finger on the posterior spine, one finger on the anterior spine, and if you have a look from a sideways position, you'll see that Keegan's posterior spine is just above my anterior spine, and that's about neutral. Now we can go back to our goniometer and we can line them up and check, and we can do a similar way, and it would be roughly about 15 degrees. So if we go into an extreme anterior tilt, now watch my fingers are again, anterior spine here, posterior spine there. See the difference in the height? Posterior is much higher, so that's an anterior tilt. If we go back to a posterior tilt, you'll see now how my anterior spine here is much lower than my posterior spine. If it's below horizontal, that's a posterior tilt. So neutral is what Keegan's got roughly, but you can see posterior and anterior, how they fit. So now that we've looked at the 3 components that you use to measure the 2 out of 3 rule, I'll just remind you again, we look at lumbar curve, we look at hip flexion angle, and then we look at ASIS to PSIS angle. So what we're looking for with each of those 3 tests is to have 2 of those tell us the same thing. So if we get 2 scores that tell us that person has an anterior tilt, 2 out of 3 say anterior, therefore we use anterior tilt. If we don't get 2 that agree, then we normally call that a neutral tilt. So we might have one that says too much curve here, which is anterior, but we might have one that says PSIS is low, which means posterior. If you get conflict between anterior and posterior, then it's neutral. You need 2 scores to give you exactly the same reading in order for you to make a statement that that person has that type of tilt.